Okay, I have 12 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. If we have a couple new names this week, which is awesome. If you haven't met me, my name is Sarah Havens, and I'm a field specialist in natural resources for University of Missouri Extension. And this is our Women Owning Woodland virtual lunch and learn. So I do this once a week. So I usually change and advertise for registration on a monthly basis. So you register for the whole month at a time, but of course can kind of pick and choose which ones you come to. I do record them each week, and then send them out as a YouTube link. So they're available. So if you can't make something but want to hear about it, you can access it later. Or if you want to go back and listen to it again, it's always available. So, and then what is Women Owning Woodland? So this is our program that we here at Extension, along with partners from Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, MDC, National Wild Turkey Federation. We're kind of all working together to develop this to provide some learning opportunities for women landowners and women woodland enthusiasts. So we have a variety of things like field days, lunch and learns, and classes that are geared specifically to women landowners and woodland enthusiasts. Also a Facebook page that I try to keep up with different opportunities from other areas, and a place to come if you have questions. So always feel free to post anything to that Facebook page if you have a question about something. Today's topic, I forgot about my upcoming events. So not all of these are women owning woodland events, but they are upcoming forestry related or natural resources related events across the state. So the Summer Woodland Steward webinar series, so that'll be virtual in the evenings on Tuesdays from 7 to 8:30. We're going to cover mast for wildlife, identifying understory trees and shrubs, and then cost share programs. So that'll be the 3 nights that we have with that. There's a forestry summit if anyone's interested. This is put on by the Forest and Woodland Association of Missouri and our Missouri Tree Farm Group. That's in Columbia next week, the 10th through the 11th. And then if you're in the northern part of the state or up for a road trip, I've partnered with Women Caring for the Land, which is part of Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever, to put on a field day. You may have joined us in the past. So we've put one of these on, one in St. Genevieve last August. And then in June of this year, we had one down at the Southwest Center in Mount Vernon. So it'll be pretty similar to those two, but this one will be up in Kirksville, so we can hit that northeast part of the state. And then the Wow August Lunch and Learns are today, and next Monday after that, and Monday after that, and the Monday after that. So Mondays in August for Lunch and Learns. And without further ado, I'm going to talk about herbicides today. So what do we use herbicides in the woods for? So we often most commonly use them for removing trees in a timber stand improvement. So this is when we are doing a thinning. Removing invasive species is another very common use of herbicides in the woods. Preventing stump sprouting after a harvest or a thinning. And then keeping trails open. So sometimes we have a use to try and, if we've let a trail go for too long, but we'd like to keep it open, we can use herbicide to treat that. So those are our main uses. Choosing the right herbicide. So this is can and sometimes is a stumbling block right out of the gate, is trying to figure out what the right one is to use. And hopefully after today, you'll have a better idea of what to look for. And when you're looking at labels and reading about herbicides and deciding on which one's the right one for you, hopefully after you learn a little bit about how to choose the right one, it'll make that job easier. We do want to choose an herbicide that's going to have the lowest risk. So if we are trying to treat, something small, we probably don't need the big guns for that. So we would try to choose the least toxic and lowest risk herbicide for that, and the lowest risk method. So we'll talk about methods that herbicides get put on and used specifically in forestry practices. So again, depending on your skill level or what you feel comfortable with, that also can be a lowest risk, is determining that method of putting it out. Most efficient. So just like with anything else, if we are very efficient with this, it has a lower environmental impact. It is more cost effective. It does have lower risk to us, and we can take care of whatever we're trying to manage in the forest right out of the gate. Most cost effective, again, this is important for a lot of landowners. We don't necessarily have to spend hundreds of dollars when something that costs $20 might get the job done. So a little bit of research can help us find those more cost effective herbicides. Soil type, here in Missouri, we are blessed and cursed with some stuff like karst topography and some rockier soils. So knowing your soil type and the right herbicides for that can be useful, because some soil types will either inhibit or exacerbate the herbicides, and you want to know what that outcome would be. Plant species. So not all plant species can be treated with the exact same herbicide. So herbicides are geared towards specific plant types or plant species. So if we're targeting trees, we don't necessarily want to use an herbicide that's been put together for a grass, for example. Density, so how much are we treating? And we'll talk about a few examples. So if you're treating something like Japanese stiltgrass, which is a very dense invasive species that can take over a woodland floor, that is going to be really dense, and treating individual stems is probably not going to be in your best interest or time effective. So you might want to look at something like broadcast spraying. Well, then you need to know which herbicide is great for broadcast spraying, and also I'm not going to harm your trees. So you would start, kind of start from that point. So it's important to know how much we're treating. The size of what we're treating. So are we treating big trees, little trees, broadleaf plants, perennials or annuals? Like how big are they growing? What coverage do we need to get to treat them? That's important. Time of year. So different herbicides have different, react differently depending on temperature, depending on seasonal changes. So for example, in the spring, one method we talk about today is called hack and squirt or frill cutting. So we actually cut parts into the tree and then treat those with herbicide. Well, if it's springtime, there's a lot of sap flow, and it's going to push that herbicide out of that tree, and that is going to give us a pretty ineffective treatment, and we're not going to have the kill rate that we would like. Weather conditions. So certain ones last longer, and if we are going to have rain in the near future, we don't want to treat because that'll wash away that herbicide, and again, we'll have a less effective treatment because of that. Target plant location. So the site you will use the herbicide on is important to know, because different herbicides actually have specific site uses on them. So is it going to be a right of way, like under telephone line or power line, or perhaps it's just like an open pipeline? Is it wildlife openings? So these are, more like food plots. So we want to make sure we have something that has a really fast turnover rate. We don't want anything that's going to be residual in that part of the woods. Is it strictly forest? Wetlands. So if you're going to be located close to water, wetlands, ponds, streams, you want to make sure that you get a water approved or aquatics approved herbicide. So there are some that are better than others, and that they actually have labels for approved usage close to wetlands. And then industrial sites. So again, most of us are probably not going to be using herbicides on an industrial site, but you never know. But that does make a difference depending on the herbicides that we can utilize. If you're reading the label, which I hope all of you are reading the label before choosing an herbicide to use, there are restrictions, restricted use versus general use. So restricted use, if the EPA label says that it is restricted use, this is going to require the applicator to be a certified applicator. So this means that you would have to have gone through what they call pesticide applicators training, and then you keep that up from year to year. So that is it's restricted, so you cannot use those herbicides or pesticides if you do not have that credential. And then the restricted use statement will indicate the specific hazard of the pesticide. So if it's a hazard to livestock, if it's a hazard to humans, if it's a hazard perhaps to water, it will say that. And so as a pesticide applicator that has had the training, you will understand how to interpret those specific hazards and how to avoid causing any harm using those hazards. If it's a generally used herbicide, which is pretty much what most of us are going to be able to use in the woods, that's kind of the stuff you'll find, just on the shelf at the farm store. So if there's not a restricted use statement, then it is considered general use. No applicator certification as long as you're applying this on property that you own or rent. You should absolutely positively still read all directions and follow all safety guidelines, wearing all your personal protective equipment. So even though it's generally used, still doesn't mean that it has hazards associated with it. But generally, our generally used herbicides are not going to have as extreme of hazards attached to them as our restricted use ones. Selectivity, this refers to the resistance that various classes of plants have to an herbicide. You want to make sure that your targeted species will be controlled by the herbicide. So for example, if you're targeting Johnson grass, you don't want to buy an herbicide that targets broadleaves. You want to make sure you have the right herbicide for whatever you're trying to control. There are some broad spectrum herbicides that can control all classes of plants, meaning that they kind of have like a universal toxicity to any plant. With these, we want to be careful where and when we apply those and how we apply them, because again, we don't want to harm anything that we intend to leave in our forest. So we don't want any of that herbicide to be taken up. And this is also important thinking about where you use it. So I actually have personal experience with this. I have a garden and I had, tomatoes and peppers and some other stuff in it. It's not a very big garden. It's kind of on the edge of the woods. And I had some black locusts that popped up in it. And my husband actually used Tordon, which is an herbicide we'll talk about in a graph I have later. He used that because that's kind of, what we had on hand. Pretty common herbicide to use with woody species, very effective at eliminating woody species. However, it is known, it has a lot of, it takes up that herbicide and puts it in its roots, and you will have a lot of crossover. So it actually killed about half of my garden with that residual herbicide and with some root transfer with it. So a better choice probably would have been an herbicide that had some glyphosate in it. So it tends to stay on the species that we want to control better. And so again, just kind of knowing the situation can help you choose the best herbicide for your work. Herbicide activity, this refers to how the product enters the plant. So we have some herbicides that are a foliar spray, so we spray them on the leaves. We have others that enter the plant through the stem. So this might be basal bark sprays, or it might also be something that we kind of inject or put into the stem. And then some actually enter the plant specifically through the roots. And a lot of herbicides have more than one type of activity. So again, just reasons for us to be careful when we use them. Forest herbicide application methods. So these are how we would put the herbicide on. So one method is frill applications, otherwise known as hack and squirt, stem injection, a cut stump method, basal bark treatment, a foliar spray, and then there's something called basal soil. And this one's not too commonly used, but we'll talk about how they all work. So frill application, this is a pretty common method that we use, particularly with a TSI or a thinning, or perhaps we have a couple invasive trees that we'd like to get rid of from our woods. So you can use a hatchet or a similar device. This is also sometimes done with girdling. So we will girdle the entire tree with a chainsaw, and then we will apply herbicide to those cuts. So if we use the hack and squirt method, we want to cut at kind of a downward angle all around the tree. So we usually try to leave no more than an inch in between hacks. And then we will spray herbicide into those cuts. And so we cut downward. This forms kind of a cup that will hold the herbicide so it can, as it gets taken up by the tree. And we want to make sure that those cuts penetrate the bark and into the living tissue. So that's what's going to really take up the herbicide to cause that tree to die. And then this is a method we don't want to use during heavy sap flow. And because again, if we have a lot of sap pushing out of that tree, it is going to push out the herbicide with it, and we will perhaps not have a complete kill of that tree. And then we can have, especially if it's a species that is, kind of considered invasive or a nuisance tree. So in some parts of Missouri, sugar maple and red maple can be very heavy in the understory, and they can shade out our oak trees and our oak regeneration. And so this is one common way for us to treat those specific species in those instances. But we don't want them to have any sprouting. So we want to treat them with an herbicide because we want to get rid of all the regeneration of that particular species to improve it for the oak regeneration. Another method is called stem injection. So this is kind of the same idea, but instead it uses a little bit more specialized equipment. Again, most of us, if we kind of have we're just treating trees on our own property and kind of doing this, in a pretty not every year kind of thing. These are probably tools we wouldn't invest in, just because hack and squirt or girdling and treating are going to be a little bit easier as far as equipment, but they are pretty cool ways to do it. And if you hire like a TSI crew or a forester to come in and do some of your treatments, they might have these tools because they do this a lot. So it'll use a hatchet or a lance type injector, and it is actually calibrated to deliver the proper amount of herbicide with each blow. And so if you look in the above picture, this has kind of like pre-measured out herbicide on his belt. And then that hatchet actually is called a hypo hatchet. It's kind of like a hypodermic needle. So it actually has a hole come all the way through it, and then at the sharp edge. And when you hit, it will deliver a calibrated amount of herbicide to each of those blows. So it's, again, kind of like the girdling method, but it's you're spraying your herbicide and making your cuts all at the same time. The other thing is, the other one is kind of actually really truly like a hypodermic needle, and it is called a tree injector, and it has kind of a sharpish point that'll kind of damage the bark and allow that hypodermic piece to make its way to the living tissue, and then you can actually directly inject the herbicide into it. Again, both these are pretty specific tools that most of our typical landowners aren't going to have on hand, but if it's good to be familiar with them. And this is another one we don't use during heavy sap flow because it'll push that herbicide out, so we don't have a complete removal of those trees with the herbicide, because they can then it might kill the top part of the tree, but if it doesn't get into the roots, which is where all that sap's coming from most of the time, then we can have stump sprouting from it. The next method, which is, this one's another pretty common way that we treat trees. And again, this is to prevent stump sprouting. So if we've removed all the maples from a forest, or again, this one's very commonly used, especially with invasive species. So if you removed, I can't think of the word right now. Autumn olive, which is kind of a more tree-like shrub, or if you've removed a Callery pear, for example, this is a good treatment option for that. So tree gets completely cut, and then we will have a water-soluble herbicide mix that's sprayed on, and it just has to be sprayed on the living tissue or the sapwood. So that's that lighter ring of bark or outer ring of wood in the cross section of the stump. And we want to hit this immediately after cutting, because you've probably seen trees, they kind of form a layer over top where they've sort of healed. It's like a scab. And so if this happens, then it's not going to take up that herbicide as easily. If you do use an oil-based herbicide mixture, there's been some research that shows you can actually come back later because the oil is taken up a little bit more effectively than the water-soluble mixture after it's healed over. The next method is basal bark treatment, and this one is actually pretty effective and probably the least labor intensive of the applications that we have. But you can use a low pressure backpack sprayer, and the basal bark, this is actually an oil-based herbicide, so that it holds on and sticks to that bark and will be absorbed through that bark. And it'll stay on there even if you want to make sure we don't have rain immediately after, but it will hold up to rain for a period of time, won't wash the oil off. But we spray the entire lower part of the stem, so 12 to 15 inches, completely around the tree, all the way down to the root collar. We do want to be careful not to spray in a place where we would expect like a lot of runoff, because we don't want, we want the herbicide to stay where we put it until it, they have half-lives, and then they'll go through those half-lives and then they aren't considered toxic after that. But we don't want to have too much runoff. This works best for thin barked trees and trees that are less than 6 inches diameter at the base. This is a good method for, again, I always think of maple with this one. If we have a place where sugar maple or red maple have kind of taken over our understory and we're trying to get rid of them, this is a good method for that. It's also good treatment for, there's a invasive species called tree of heaven, and it tends to have multiple thin bark stems that pop up. I will precaution you with that one if you're having to fight against that one. It is a prolific sprouter, even with treatment of herbicides and cutting. It still tends to have stump sprouting, so it's an invasive species that takes a lot of treatment to eradicate it completely. The next method is a foliar spray. So this is using an aerial or ground spray application, such as a backpack sprayer. Also can be, there are sprayers that can be attached, again, not for the regular landowner, but if we were trying to treat a really large conservation area, for example, we can use actual aerial spraying that gets attached to helicopters or airplanes. And then there's also some spray applicators that can be put on like a skidder and can treat a wide area. Again, for most of our landowners, we aren't going to have anything that needs treated on that wide of a scale, so a backpack sprayer is perfect. And in foliar spray, the herbicide gets misted onto the foliage of our targeted plants. This generally can be used to control woody plants, herbaceous weeds. In some parts of the world, ferns are invasive, grasses and vines. So foliar spray, a use that comes to mind with this, or a good use of foliar spray, is going to be your honeysuckle. So honeysuckle tends to put on green before the rest of our native species, and they also tend to stay green longer than our native species. So it's not uncommon for honeysuckle to still have green leaves into the beginning of November, whereas much of our other stuff has gone into dormancy. So this is a good time for foliar spray of it, because it's the only thing that has foliage on. So it's not going to harm any of our natives that we have there, because they've all gone dormant and they're not going to take any of it up. So you can spray that foliage then. Again, also, if you have something really widespread that's really taken over an area, this might be a good method. I'm thinking things like garlic mustard, Japanese stilt grass, anything that kind of fills in an area that we want to, have to do a big treatment to get rid of. Foliar spray is usually the best. Also a good method for taking care of multiflora rose. So multiflora rose can be pretty hairy to deal with because of all its thorns. And so a foliar spray can allow us to kind of hit everything without having to try and cut or any other types of treatment with all those thorns that it has on its stems. A basal soil treatment. So this one is not super commonly used, but we use what's called a spot gun applicator, and it does pretty much an exact delivery. So here he's actually treating, this is a tree of heaven tree that he's treating here, and he is spraying kind of all around that targeted root, and then it will go in, and this is likely probably a broadleaf herbicide that he's using that's going to be taken up through the soil and into the root system. This, we want to target pretty much close to that root collar and where it's going to take it up. If we're treating a whole huge area, so perhaps we have a really extensive invasive species, or we have an extensive number of plants in one area that need to be taken care of, they will sometimes use a grid pattern across the treatment area in order to get uptake. This is a good treatment for if we're trying to get rid of annual and perennial weeds and woody plants. Depending on what herbicide you use, you can use it for those. Then a quick overview of toxicity. So research and development have produced effective, low risk, and environmentally friendly products when applied and used according to our labels. So they've become lots of research has been put into this to make sure that we use the least amount to have the biggest returns. And so toxicity refers to the product's ability to cause injury or illness to living organisms. And I should also say that they prove to be very low risk to humans when we use the correct personal protective equipment. At a minimum, if you're applying herbicide, you should be wearing eye protection, gloves to protect skin, long sleeves, and pants to also protect skin from any direct contact with it. And that's, kind of at a minimum, depending on what we're putting out. Toxicity signal words. So just when you're looking at the label, these are some of the ones that you'll come across. So caution means that the product is slightly toxic or practically non-toxic, either orally, dermally, or through inhalation, and will cause maybe slight eye or skin irritation. And this has, and I'm going to tell you on the next slide about what this LD50 stands for, but usually if it just says caution, it is going to have an LD50 greater than 500 milligrams per kilogram. Again, we'll talk about that on the next slide. Warning means it's moderately toxic, and danger. So if it has just danger without the skull and crossbones, it just means that it can cause severe skin irritation or eye damage, and is more dangerous with than what the acute oral LD50 might suggest. And then the last one is the most toxic, is a danger with poison and skull and crossbones. And this one can have an LD50 that ranges from trace to 50 milligrams per kilogram. And as promised, what does that mean? So LD50 stands for lethal dose 50, and this is the amount of product lethal by ingestion to 50% of a population of test animals, usually it's rats, under laboratory conditions. And they are expressed in milligrams of pesticide per kilogram of body weight. And the larger the LD50 value, the less toxic the chemical is. And so I have this kind of relative toxicity of some of our common forestry herbicides. So kind of, if you look, most of our most common, so clopyralid, phosphamine, glyphosate, imazapyr, picloram. So those have an LD50 of greater than 5,000 milligrams per kilogram before they are lethal to 50% of a population. A few of our other more stronger ones. So again, you might be familiar. This is one that's been in the news quite a bit. Dicamba is one that's had a lot of we've had a lot of issues with drift on that one, where it's killing things that it's not supposed to, or it's affecting things it's not supposed to. And that's like, it's been sprayed in a foliar basis in a field, and we have drift using the wind, which then can cause damage to other existing plants around it that it wasn't intended for. And this is kind of an example of being aware of weather and the product we're using and how we're using it. And then triclopyr, which is in garland, and this is also one that's often in is used a lot for treating woodies, but it is one of the more toxic ones. And then by comparison, so again, I pulled this from Penn State Extension. Here's some other things, LD50s. So table salt is at 3,000. Interestingly enough, 7 dust, which is again another kind of a common pesticide in the garden, is at 230, and caffeine is at 192. So just kind of for reference and looking about the relative toxicity of it. And if you wear your PPE, the hazard to you is pretty much non-existent. And what would we use these different methods for? So again, foresting improvement, we often would use that frill girdle method, stem injection, basal bark, or foliar spray. Most common practices that are used when we put herbicide there. If we're doing a pre-commercial thinning, which we don't do as much pre-commercial thinning in hardwoods as we do in pines, but you could go through and do a hack and squirt or a stem injection or basal bark treatment. Most of the time in a pre-commercial thinning, the trees are too large to do any type of foliar spray. So it would be pretty much impossible to get that herbicide up to them on their leaves, and would be a big hazard to everything else around it. Site preparation. So again, if we were prepping an area that was maybe not forested before, or we, again, in pine, we manage them just a little bit differently because they require open soil and open full sun. And so in some cases, we'll go through and treat everything that's there so we can plant pine after. And so that would, a lot of commonly uses foliar spray, basal bark treatments, or basal soil sprays for that site prep. Again, we don't do that very much in Missouri. Release operations. So again, if we're trying to take out certain trees and release others, we can use pretty much all the methods that we listed and talked about today, except for this basal soil treatment. And then invasive plant control. And I would say that this is probably where most of our herbicide usage comes into forest work in Missouri, because we unfortunately have a lot of invasive species, and we do our best to try and get rid of them. But so you could use, depending on the invasive species, because they range from everything from a grass to a tree. In those invasive plant categories, you could use just about any method depending on the species you're treating. And then this is probably what everybody is looking for, but this is a list of the most common herbicides used in forest management. And I will send this in a separate, I'll copy this table out of here and also send it in the email with the recordings. But this kind of has an overview of all the, and it is by chemical name, and then it has target plants. So this can help you kind of figure out which, if you're trying to treat something specific, it can help you kind of identify what you're specifically trying to treat. And then it has resistant plants. So here I'll give you an example. So hexazinone, which is in Velpar and Pronone and Velosa, it has a lot of soil activity, and it is used for some grasses, a lot of annual perennial broadleaves, and then it can be used to also treat oak and hickory. But all of our sassafras, black gum, tulip, poplar, red maples, and most conifer species show resistance. So if I was using, so this one's commonly used in pine management. So if I'm doing some site prep, I might use this because I'm trying to get rid of the grasses, broadleaves, and some of those oaks and hickories taking over. If I was trying to perhaps manage my oak hickory forest, I would not want to use hexazinone because of that. So again, it's important to understand both the target plants and the resistant plants. And then this has the brands. So if you are at the farm store and kind of looking through the herbicide to try and figure out, what's what, here's a lot of the common brands that you'll run into. And then again, you can kind of see, and here's this infamous Tordon. So its active ingredient is pechlorum. I mean, you can see here it's annual, biennial, perennial broadleaf plants and woody plants, but most grasses are resistant. So, and again, and look at this soil activity, it's high. So even though the herbicide was painted onto a cut stem, it made its way through because of that soil activity to the other plants around it. So again, this can just kind of help you make your decisions when you're trying to decide what is best to use. Like I said, I will cut this out and put it in my email with you. And then another important thing, which is reading the label. So this has kind of like your mixture. So, look at the amount of chemical per acre. So this is one that's being used for site preparation. So it's going to pretty much be trying to clear the entire area. So this has how much I need per acre. So I'd mix 5 pounds and 3/4 pound together. And then it has kind of an idea of the operation I'm doing, the crop species I'm trying to improve upon, how I want to apply it. So if I want to do an aerial or a ground broadcast, when to do it, and then the applied products. So I can kind of see which the applied rate of each product by name brand. And then, so sometimes we mix something called an adjuvant. So you'll sometimes find this if you're at the store, picking up herbicide. This is going to be usually a surfactant that helps it stick on. It's not like with basil bark spraying, we would use an adjuvant to help it stick to add to the chemical to help it stick to the bark. And then again, this has kind of application guidelines. And again, some overall performance notes about it. Are there any questions? I will stop sharing so you can see. Say 3 biggest things, to look at the label, know what PPE, appropriate way to spray it or use it. Make sure that it's going to hit the target plants that you want to. You need to know what you're targeting before you start thinking about herbicide treatment. And then again, thinking about cost effective and which one's going to be the best fit for what you're doing. So, and I would say I always get questions about like more natural herbicide treatments. So things like Dawn and vinegar and salt mixtures to be used for weeds. And again, depending on what you're treating, a lot of times there aren't any of those that are very effective for treating woody plants. And then actually some of those can be more long lasting than the actual herbicides are. So they do not have the half-lives that we see in some of our herbicides that are made specifically for things like forest management. So they can cause like long-term harm to your soil by adding some of that because it does not break down and disappear as fast. Any questions today about it? Say this is one of it's not always the most fun topic to talk about because it would be awesome if we could get by without having to use any herbicide. But unfortunately, particularly in the invasive species control realm, it's one of the only ways that we can effectively control them. in an effective time and cost efficient manner. I don't, if anyone's ever tried to fight honeysuckle, I know that I've gone at it even just like, I don't know, probably half-acre lot, trying to pull and pull and pull, and it's just, it seems overwhelming. And so sometimes this herbicide can just, especially if you're thinking about a big area like a, woodland, it can be the most cost-effective and time-efficient way. So again, not my favorite thing, but it is one of our important tools that we use. Yes, so for burning bush, a recommendation I have is glyphosate is pretty effective against it. It is smaller stems. So, and again, always with herbicide, again, cost efficiency and, safety. So that's one that you can, you want to make sure you label your bottles all correctly, but you can put, usually like a 20% glyphosate mixture in a, like a dropper bottle. And because they have, most of our burning bush stems are pretty an inch, 2 inches, maybe tops. So you putting it in that dropper bottle, very efficient way to put just the right amount of herbicide on it without overdoing it. And then you can add or if you can use Tordon on them, but I'd be careful just about other transfer to other organisms around it. But if you have a lot of burning bush and it's kind of all in a stand, the Tordon probably is not going to affect anything else except burning bush. But also you can pick up, there's colorant that can go in with your herbicide. So on one of those pictures, when you saw the stump treatment, it was blue. So that can help you know which ones you've treated. Anything else? Next week, we're going to talk about forest measurements. So this is just about some terminology and important measurements that we use to assess forests. So if you've heard reference in other forestry programs, or maybe in a management plan, you've seen the terms about like basal area or diameter breast height. We're going to talk about what all those terms mean so you can kind of better understand, if you listen to other forestry programs, what they're talking about. And again, help you interpret things like management plans for the future. So, and then after that, we'll have a little bit of fun on the 16th and talk about mushrooms. All right, if no other questions, I'm gonna close this out. I will see you next Monday. Thank you.